Okay, we start, right? Yeah, please. It's not starting recording. How do you do this? It's not one thing, it's the next. Okay. So,
you mind going to Kitsu?
Yeah. We'll review.
Does this mean that anytime
We're up to
Does this mean that anytime you have Kabbalah souls that you're able to touch this tremendous?
Well, let's review it now, and I'll answer the question. So we learned yesterday. It's Peruk Reish Chav Gimel, Ayin Beis. I'm just saying it for a point of reference. Page Tofnun Beis, 452, chapter 223. The name is Hashem Amar Amachasa. So what we learned was the Rebbe Rashab is summing up the section about the Mamutza, which is called Chachmas Tima, and we called it the unconscious mind or the superconscious mind. Basically, it's the source of Seichel, and that becomes the interface, the bridge between the Maitzel and the Netzolim. Why is it a bridge? Because on one hand, it has a common denominator with the Netzolim, with the emanation of Chachma Gluya. In other words, it's ultimately not just amorphous, abstract, atzmus without any shape and form. It does have some manifestation as wisdom. On the other hand, it's not Chachma Gluya as we know it, so it has a common denominator with the source. And that itself, the Rebbe Rashab is dissecting Chachmas Tima, the Primis Chachmas Tima, Chetzenis Chachmas Tima. Where Chetzenis Chachmas Tima is Chachma of Arich, Primis Chachmas Tima is Chachma of Atik, coming the Moichim of Atik, and the distinction there is that Chetzenis Chachmas Tima is closer to being the source of Chachma Gluya, but it's still not completely, because it's like Derech Cyrus, it's B'derech Dilug. In other words, like the Mazel that he says from Neitzah. So Chachma Gluya, to receive. In other words, when we get a conception of an idea that it comes into our mind, comes from the unconscious of Chachma Stima Chetzenius, it comes like drops, like through a faucet. That's the emotion I was using, or like a cider. In other words, it's not coming directly, which is critical here, because you want Chachma Stima still to have some feature of Elikus. So therefore, there's that, but it still has a relationship because it's unconscious, but the unconscious is a source for the conscious. And then there's the Primis Chachma Stima, which really connects it closer, because Atik is completely removed from Chachma, so it's like the unconscious of the unconscious, is the best way I could describe it. And that is removed, but it is still Chachma, ultimately. And in explaining this flow, the flow, how it goes from all of this, the Rebbe Rashab went into an explanation of comparing it to what we discussed in Chachma Gluya. Just like in conscious thinking, conscious mind, you have the two elements of Chachma, the Keyach HaYerida and the Keyach HaFla. So just what does that mean specifically? It means that when a person uses their mind, they're able to go to places that are beyond survival, let's put it this way, beyond existence. You could dream, you can fantasize, you can abstract, you can, as we spoke yesterday at the end, cognitively you can reach places that emotionally and personally you're not able to reach there. For example, you can talk about Yechudei Law or Erein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, and intellectually you can imagine it. I mean, I can't say we know it, because if you knew it, you'd be it. But we can talk about it, and we do it. We talk about things. We talk about things that are beyond us all the time. You talk about Geula. We're not in the world of Geula, but we can meditate. What kind of world would it be? Maybe through Yediyas Hashlila, through process of elimination. What kind of world would it be if there was no war and there was no destruction, and there was no famine? There's, in other words, we can talk about a world that is much purer than our own because our minds are able to go there. Whereas, for example, an animal or anything in nature is unable to go beyond its own parameters. An animal does not, as I said, the Friedrich Rebbe said, an animal never saw heaven. It walks on all fours, so it doesn't dream about it. There's no concept of Su Mora Meinechem, raise your eyes to heaven and see Ru'umi Bara who created you. Even on a Gashmizdika level, there's a multi-billion-dollar industry called NASA, just to satisfy human curiosity. We look up to the stars and we want to know what's there. This is uniquely human. Animals don't do that. So uniquely human is the fact that we search and with our minds we can go to places. That's like Koyach HaFla. And then there's Koyach HaYirida of Chachma, which is bringing it down, explaining it, manifesting it in Mashalim and so on. So the Rebbe Rashab is saying, just like we learned that the deeper you go, the further down you want to go in explaining it, the deeper you have to go in so-called in the Hafla and the wonder of it. So he uses this as an example. The same thing is an unconscious mind, which is fascinating because he's like really dissecting the unconscious, and you really hear this. Also has these two elements that the chitzenius of Chachmas Tema is, relatively speaking, is bringing it down. I mean, it's still not bringing it down, but we're talking about relative to previous Chachmas Tema. It's bringing it and and becomes a source for bringing it to Chachma Gluya, to reveal Chachma. And previous Chachmas Tema goes into the so-called the essence of how eloquent. In other words, this idea that we're able to go with our minds beyond us is really coming because the Eibishter planted or created this thing called Chachma. And he says, you know what? I'm going to give human beings Chachma where they will begin to be able to imagine me. They'll be able to dream about me. They'll be able to envision me with their minds at least. And and through their minds they'll ultimately bring it down to their hearts. The famous word from the Alter Rebbe where he asks, when Mashiach comes, it says, "V'hasidesi leiv ha'evan," that I will remove a heart of stone. So the Alter Rebbe asks, why does it say heart of stone, not mind of stone? So his answer is unbelievable. It's really the essence of Chassidus Chabad. He said, because the mind of stone, we don't need Hashem to remove. That we can do ourselves. That's our avodah. That you can, with your mind, you can go there. A heart to feel Yichud Ilah, for example, to feel the bittul, the mitzias.
Much harder removing.
The Alter Rebbe's word. The Rebbe brings it. He brings it. Yeah. Well, let me explain the word. It means that you can sit and learn about Elokus with your mind, even if you don't fully integrate it in Avodah.
And also, why do you have to go up higher and higher with the floor to go down lower? I mean, why do you have to get higher up to bring it down lower? I didn't understand what
he explained that back then. I think if I recall correctly, he explained that number one is that for someone to be able to be malbish, someone that needs to be able to explain it with a mashal has to understand it deeper.
Even better.
Right.
So it's the same type of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So to go back to that, so the Alter Rebbe's vort is very consistent. In other words, the mind can go to places the heart can't go in Golos, for example. The fact is, look, all of us can understand certain things in Elokus, and the bottom line is it comes down to action. We don't live up to it. Because when it comes to emotions and your subjective needs and your self-interest, you just don't live up. But bottom line is, we always understand things in a purer way than our feelings. That's the Aveda. I mean, look, Chassidus asks of us that, but first use your mind, and from the Mayach it'll give birth to Midas. But anyway, so the bottom line is that the mind goes, and that's essentially what he's saying is that the mind is a gift from the Eibishter, that he gave us something with which we can perceive him. And that's the mamutza, essentially. That's the interface. But more specifically, is the premise of Chachmas Tema that is the awesomeness of it, the godliness of, let's call it, the abstract and godliness, the elokus in it. The Chenish Chachmas Tema, let's call it the slower level of the unconscious, is bring it down, ultimately, till it comes down to our minds. Remember, we don't usually think in this way because we always think with the mind from the bottom up. I have an idea, and then you develop your idea. He's speaking here, where do ideas come from? The Rebbe Rashab is going into the world of the unconscious, which we don't usually go to. We go the other way. From conscious, we extrapolate to the unconscious. when a person, for example, tells you what they're thinking, then you could say, you know what, maybe there's a deeper thing in there. Here he's really explaining how it goes Mamayla Lamata. Anyway, so the end of this, so the second half of this Perek was now the process, and the Rebbe Rashab explains how does this work. How do we bring Primis Chachmas Timah? So what I was not clear, and still not clear, I have to learn it more, was the flow from the unconscious to the conscious is a certain natural flow. You sit down, you start thinking about ideas. Ideas come to us. But then he started giving the example, a person's conceiving of a new idea, and it doesn't always come. On page Tofnum Gimel, like 10 lines. It doesn't come. It's not happening. And as he explained, you can't force it. And sometimes you're not conceiving. So from this he concluded that you have to say that there's some regulator that's above the unconscious, that so-called compels the unconscious to be mamshich ideas into the conscious. And he called that das of Atik, or the avir, the space above the mind, in other words, the space beneath the crown, above the crown of the brain. And that, he said, is the hiskashrus. This das is machrich esasme hiskashr, hukei chamaskil. This is what connects chachmas timah to come into chachma gluya. And he explains that if you want to get this generator to work, you need something to, like a trigger, and the trigger is limud with Kabbalah Sel, which means when a person completely, let's say, completely dedicates and commits himself to learning, he says b'derech nesina, completely commits himself, through that, in a way, he triggers this generator das of Atik, the premise of Chachmas Timah, which so-called compels the Chitzenis Chachmas Timah to come into Chachma Gluya. That was the end of the Perek. So therefore, here we have the process that from Chachma Gluya, the Chachma is the Mamutza, and he has the Aveda of it that we do it through Kabbalah Sel. So my understanding, at least at this level, is that there's really, in other words, like two ways that the unconscious goes into the conscious. One is the natural way, even if you don't have Kabbalah Sel, people have ideas. And then, to really reach into the Pnimius, into the deepest part of Chachmas Timah, the deeper part, the Pnimius, is through Kabbalah Sel. And then he adds just one line that as the Koyach of Er Chezer is not just that you bring down part of Chachmas, the Pnimius Chachmas Timah doesn't just add Shleimus to Chachma, to the lower Chachmas Timah, but you actually have it through Er Chezer, which is what he said earlier was Aveda of Tshuva. That's a summation, best as I can give what we learned. It's pretty heavy stuff here, because it's like a real analysis of this whole process. Now, to be honest, to really get it, I think we have to go back and learn the beginning, the beginning of the sugya here, where he started, to see how it all ties together. But right now we're just continuing on, so we'll continue on. What did you ask?
Anytime the question was, anytime you have Kabbalah Sel, that this actually takes place. Anytime you're learning with Kabbalah Sel.
Every time, look. The truth is, it's very bekitzer, very dense. He doesn't really analyze it in all details. It appears it's a method.
It seems to be a matana, no? Like when it's in other words.
He doesn't really use that word. It's not like a zgula. It's not a zgula.
It's not only a matana, because he's giving us a method.
No, it's a method, but when you have Kabbalah Sel, so what does it?
No, I understand what it means. I'll tell you how I understand it. Now, I don't think it's that like the matana. I'll tell you what it is. It's like what it says about Shammai and Hillel. Why is the halacha like Hillel? The Gemara says because Hillel was amvison. He was humble. So Chassidus asks, what does humility have to do with a psak halacha? The Shammai, if you said Hillel had better arguments, Torah arguments, okay. If you said Hillel, brought more psukim, so Chassidus explains because his humility, it says in Samach Vav later, Kol Hashem halachas. He says because humility takes you out of the picture. So even though Shammai was also humble, but Hillel was more humble, since it takes you out of the picture, it makes you a keli for the emes, much more than so. So it's not about Tana. So you could say Kabbalah sale gets rid of all the traps that block, that don't allow the flow to happen. That's how I would understand it.
That's a nice way of saying it, really.
Yeah.
Much better than I heard yesterday.
Yeah. So like for example, like I always thought about it, because Chassidus says that when the Chachams Chetzenius, when you learn philosophy or science, it makes you more of a yesh. When you learn Chassidus or you learn Nelakus, it makes you more bottle. So I always thought to myself, so let me ask, if a scientist that has bittul, will he be a better scientist? And the truth is, yes, he will be a better scientist. First of all, on a very basic level, you could trust his ideas better, because it's not like, it's not self-interest that taints his experiments. That's on a basic level. And on a deeper level, Chachma by nature is a bittul dika experience. And when someone has bittul, the flow of the wisdom is going to be more truthful. Not just, I'm not talking about someone falsifying data or a blatant con artist. I mean, that's how I understand what it means. And Samach Vav, which he doesn't bring here at all, which is interesting. The Rebbe Rashab doesn't quote Samach Vav, means there may be a little different angle to it. In Samach Vav he talks about Luchas Shniyas, that the exertion, exactly, Luchas Shniyas has something over the Luchas Shushenis, because it came after the Chet Egel. And basically Talmud Bavli, through the struggle, through the exertion, that when you break your head, it's like breaking the stone.
Yeah.
You get more giluyim than when you don't break your head.
Because the exertion is just means you had Kabbalah soul and you weren't in the.
But Kabbalah soul brings on to the exertion. But here he doesn't really talk about.
No, so it's really the Kabbalah soul, but the exertion. But you can't see somebody's Kabbalah soul, but you can see his exertion. So you know what I mean.
And there too, he speaks about two levels of unconscious. By the way, he talks about there the helam sheyeshnu b'mitzias and the helam she'enu b'mitzias, which is very similar, because remember we talked about sasim l'fiyerech and sasim be'etzim. Here too, when he said chetzenis chachmas tima arich is hidden, but it's only hidden relative to the revealed, whereas sasim be'etzim, which is fundamentally concealed, is atik. In Samach Vav he calls it helam she'enu b'mitzias and helam sheyeshnu b'mitzias. Basically, the difference between the coal, the hot coal, which is hidden until you blow it, and the flintstone that you have to strike, and you cut open a coal, you touch it, it's hot. You touch a flintstone, it's not hot. You have to do something to get out the sparks. That's the example of. There definitely. I wrote one article that I wrote on Samach Vav is about the two levels of the unconscious. It's fascinating stuff, because nobody's. I mean, science, psychology has not even gone there. They barely touch the unconscious. But this could only come from someone who sees the snapshot from above, obviously. So
this whole idea is brought in Samach Vav.
No, I'm just comparing it, not really in different, completely different ICs.
No, not really.
I'm saying in Samach Vav, I just said.
No. In Samach Vav brings this the first professor that I ran into this was the idea of this machriach, making a connection, has the whole idea there.
Well, you never did the phone business.
It's on here.
Oh, it's on there.
I'm just making a comparison.
Tough.
You're talking about later. We're talking about earlier. Lech Lecha.
Okay.
The Maimorim of Teildes, Vayitn Lecha.
That I don't.
Yeah, it's earlier. It's connected. What I just said about Hillel is later, where you said Kol Hashem Alachas in the later, like tough those pages. What we're talking about is earlier, where he talks about the Luchas Shoshenis, the Luchas Shnis.
Let's bring this idea.
There's comparisons. I don't see. He doesn't recite there. So the Rebbe Rashab many times does cite Samach Vav in the Samshach. So since he doesn't cite it, I'm careful not to. It may be a somewhat not. Obviously, it doesn't contradict, but it could be a little different. Because he's here. But remember, not everything always. Chassidus is not like an encyclopedia. It doesn't. You can't always. Here he's talking this direction here, because he's going to Chachmas Timah. There he doesn't really talk about Chachmas Timah. I have to look it up again there. But anyway, so let's continue on. Rish Chavdal, you wanted to ask something.
Yeah, so this only shows up it's the way you're presenting the idea. Is it only shows up in the world of Chachma. In the world of action, it just showed up.
What do you mean by the world of action?
Kabbalah's only serious enough in the world of action.
No, he's talking here in the world of learning Torah.
I understand. So,
I mean, here's Kabbalah says not about mitzvahs or action. He's talking here that a person is, like he says, that even if he doesn't have a will to learn, you force yourself to completely dedicate yourself to learning. It's like you're doing it because the Eibusher told you to do so. Not because necessarily you have personal pleasure or you want to do. So that type of dedication basically triggers things in a deeper level.
Because you get rid of your own the ego and
Essentially, yeah.
goes,
Yeah.
and everything go through.
And the flow begins, yes.
You were saying it's only in the context of learning. That dedication.
That's what he says here, yeah. That's what he says here.
Check on your mind. We're talking about mind.
So let's go to Reish Chav Dalet.
That's Bechinat Avira.
The Bechinas Avira, he refers to it 3 times. I mean, it's from the Kabbalah, it's from Zohar, from Eitz Chaim. It refers to like this. I mean, physically, the brain. I mean, I'm not going to science, but this is how Chassidus says at least. There's an Erech in Sefer Erechin that talks about, but there's the physical brain. Let's say this is the brain, and the skull is, let's say here. Between the brain and the skull, there's space.
Meninges.
Yeah. I mean, even today, you know that.
P
Person,
and the Dora.
it's even from a
There's
natural.
2 levels of that, the P and the Dora.
But for example, naturally speaking, God forbid, when a person, let's say, gets punched or there's some shot, the brain has room to. It's not tight to that space. He calls that in Kabbalah. I mean, in Ruchni, is that space is das of Atik, Primis Chachmas Tema, that in turn can affect Chesenis Chachmas Tema, which I guess is the top of the brain, to be mamshich into the middle brain Chachma Gluya. That's how he describes it here. So Koyach HaMaskil is Chesenis Chachmas Tema. The Avir is above that. That's what he says right here.
But when we talk about
It's called Das of Atik, Das of Mechin Atik. Huh?
Penimis would probably be the level more on the outside than it's more of a.
But outside where? No, but
more the outer covering more than.
He doesn't call that. He calls it the Avir. He calls it the
Yeah,
Avir.
but it's divided into 2 sections.
I'll tell you why the outer, because the skull itself is not seichel. The skull protects the seichel. The skull is rotzen. I don't know if you can.
Yeah, but it's closer to the makiv that you're bringing into. There's 2 different ways to use panemius. One is, it turns out that the panemius, not the consonius, is if in a makiv, then becomes panemius. It's a makiv.
Yeah, well, look, there's 2 levels of makiv here. He spoke about this. There's
right.
2. Yeah, but he's calling it the Avir. This is what it's called.
Is the further makiv.
But the Avir is the further makiv.
Yeah, but that's divided into 2 places.
He doesn't divide the Avir into 2.
You just said the 2 places.
One is the Avir is the Pnimius, and the Chetzenius doesn't have the Avir, is lower than the Avir. It looks like
there's 2 parts of the Avir, so that's my.
He doesn't say there are 2 parts in the Avir. There's only 1 part in the Avir.
I mean,
But here he doesn't speak about that. He doesn't compare. He doesn't call it 2 parts of the Avir. The Avir here is only the Das of Atik.
Das Hanelam.
Das Hanelam, yeah, of Atik. Yeah. And it's higher than Koyach HaMask. Okay.
Just one general question. So when you said all this Chochma Satzma and the Chochma Panimia, this is not the Chochma that we think about. This is because Antu Chaykim Lo Chochma Yediyah, correct? So this is not the Chochma that we know of. So it is.
Antu Chochma B'Leb Chachma Yediyah could be Pnimis Chachma Stima. It's possible. That's the level of Chachma Stima. It's Chachma, but not Chachma Yediyah. You can call it that.
No, but
I'm not sure. It doesn't. I know, but that could be Pnimius Atik. That may be the level of Mechin the Atik, because it's the Meyach of Hakadosh Baruch Hu. That what you just said is that because when you even say Antu Chachma Lebechachma Yediyah, there's higher than that too. That's also some beginning.
Sure.
Yeah, it's the beginning of the. I think he said earlier that Pnimius Chachma Stima is Antu Chachma Lebechachma Yediyah. I'm almost sure in the beginning of the. I have to look. But that would be perfect. That would be excellent. Because then basically you're saying is Atzmos is completely the mile of everything. Then there's Atzmos who, you can't call him Chachma, but he's the beginning of the source of Chachma. And that slowly moves into Chetzeni's Chachma still until it comes into what we call Chachma. Remember, when we're using our Chachma properly, and it's aligned with Chachma of the Eibishter, when we learn Torah, we're learning Chachma Shel Kadosh Baruch Hu. So Hashem has Chachma. He manifests in Chachma. And there's no question there's a level of Chachma Lo B'Chachma Yediyah, but there's also Chachma more revealed. Like for example, you learned before Nigla L'Gabe Pnimius is more Chachma Gluya of the Eibishter, and Pnimius Atera is Pnimius Chachma from the Eibishter.
No, but the whole thing, after all, there are Yediyah, there are wisdom, there are thinking some subjects that you think about. When we talk about Chachma, Chachma Satima, so there's something. Is more refined level of
absolutely. The best way to explain it is unconscious mind, because we can't think about it. We can't directly. As soon as you touch it, you already made it goli. So it can only be understood as the source of what's Goli.
It's
You know?
quantum.
Huh?
It's quantum.
It is. But you can completely relate to it. Let's put it this way. Right now, your mind is concentrating, let's say, on whatever idea we're talking about. But we also know in the brain right now, there are millions of ideas that you have. You're just not conscious of them. So it's there, but it's not there consciously. So where is it exactly? The answer is, let's put it this way, it's on your hard drive, but you don't have access to it until you concentrate. So if you go there, there's many layers, many deeper layers. Like the Alter Rebbe says, for example, that Melamdim Teira Uber b'mei imay, that a child in the mother's womb learns the entire Torah, and then upon birth they're made to forget. That's the question. Right. Right. So the question is, why do you learn the whole thing and then make to forget? So he says clearly that it stays in the unconscious.
Right.
You only made to forget the chechenis. In other words, consciously you don't remember. But when you learn Torah properly, you say, aha, that's an idea, certain truths that resonate.
Mm-hmm.
So clearly there is no question inside of us. I mean, psychology, secular psychology focuses on the unconscious more like the negative things, sexuality, or memories of our childhood, or things we don't remember, etc. But the unconscious in a positive way is that we come out of our mother's womb, when we're born, we come out with a full unconscious so-called mind that understands Torah. And the rest of life is trying to find that and reconnect. Like the concept of a niggin. Why the niggin resonates? Even a newborn, even a baby in the womb. Today there's tests, they play music and the baby reacts. Because in the neshama, there is somewhere what we say, mashbir nesi titzadi v'alti rasha. Where are all these things? Somewhere inside, you come with a fully downloaded, or whatever, divine template when you come born. But it's all unconscious, and the question now is to bring it out in the conscious. That's why, real truth is like we say, when you talk to somebody, and you're not really giving them something new, you're revealing them something they always had inside of them. So let's go to Reish Chav Dalet, yeah? Okay, Reish Chav Dalet. But Inyan who... Okay, now he goes back to that Zohar. You remember all the way in the beginning, I don't know if you remember the whole Pasuk, he's talking about Kiosisa, Elef, Pella, Kiosisa, Pella. Remember that? Well, let me refer back to it. This is where the subject began. Pei Kuf Tzadik Beis. Let me just refer back to it so make sure that I'm on the target here. So if you remember, wow, it's the Rosh Hashanah Maimer actually. Okay. Yeah. So if you remember, he was talking there about the mamutza. He was talking about the pasuk. One second. It was the pasuk. That pasuk was a long elaboration. He started with the pasuk. Here we go. Go to page Shin Ayin Hey, just for a refresher a moment. Pay the Kuf Pei Dalet. Were you all here then when we were learning that? I remember we learned that. So here, on this page, if you recall correctly, you see Bira Inyan?
Mm-hmm.
He starts a whole new thing there. In understand, because he stopped there. What we're learning then, let me just refresh myself. We're learning then that the mamutza then we were talking about the mamutza being Atzilus, if you recall. It's all different levels of mamutza. And then he was practically speaking about the mamutza in Torah. If you remember all the two levels of Torah, Zmiris Hayelichu Kecha, David HaMelech called it Zmiris, but it's really higher than that. So if you see the Kitzur on page 9 Hey, basically he was talking about that there's the Chitzenis HaTorah and Primis HaTorah. It's going to be very relevant because he's going back now to this whole subject matter. So there's the two levels of the Torah. Is the Torah connected to the world or is it higher than the world? And the answer is that it's both, and there's two parts in Torah. Chitzenis HaTorah is like the blueprint, and Primis HaTorah is the way it is in Elokus. So to explain that, he said the pasuk v'oye etzlei amen. Look at the end of the Kitzur.
Blueprint for the world,
Blueprint for existence, yeah.
Okay.
God looks into the Torah and creates.
Right.
So he says, Emen muflo mechusa. So he says that there are 5 things. See there, he says that there are 5 things in that pasuk Etzlo Amen, and he never really concluded the 5. He's going to do that in the next Maimarim. So he's really now beginning to tie
5 things of what?
in that pasuk. Vayi Etzlo Amen, when it says that Vayi Etzlo, that the Torah by God is like a Amen, it's like Lashon Uman, is like a tool, a utility. So he says there are 5 things in that pasuk. And so he didn't get into detail, he just said there are 5 things. And meanwhile, he's been talking about the first thing. Amen, as you say, is muflo mechusa. The word amen also means it's wondrous and concealed. The level of atik. And to explain this level of atik, he went into a whole introduction of the pasuk v'havaya lekei ater memcha eidah shmekiyasisa pella eitzes merachak amuna uman.
That's a tool.
And started.
The Atik is a tool for the Eibishter?
It's one pirush is a tool. Here he teaches Omen Lashon Amen, which is more concealed, wondrous, something wondrous. There are different meanings in the word. And he brings the Zehar, which is now going to go back to, where it talks about the different levels in this pasuk. That this pasuk is reveals all these different levels. So the first thing he began to talk about is the point of Asisa Pella. Pella is Asius Aleph and Asius Pella. So these are the 2 things. Aleph and Pella are the 2 levels of the Mamutza. As I said, I'm just refreshing us here. And he goes on, if you look through, I'm going to move forward. Look on page Shimpei Aleph, he continues the pasuk, Kasisa Pella. Eitzes Merachik.
If that's Torah, the Torah there is a Mamutza. Why does it start with Aleph, not Beis? Why does it say Aleph?
That's what he says. And if you look on page, I said Shimpei Aleph,
Maybe that's the
he
Aleph.
continues.
That's why it has to start with Beis, because that's the Aleph.
So he continues on page Shimpei Aleph, he says about the Zohar that speaks about this kisui v'levushul islapshu. It's about the kisui, the cover, and the garment that conceals. So he's talking about here the level of Atik and the level of Arich. The bottom line is, as I said, we have to really go back there to get what he's saying, but I'm just making the point of reference. So, one minute.
Who's on the phone? Yeah.
So on page Kuf Tzadik Beis that is referring to, look on page Kuf Tzadik Beis, he basically says the 2 things of Pella and Aleph is the 2 things in Chachma. I'll just read the first few lines of that page. Kuf Tzadik Beis, page Shin Tzadik Aleph. He says, Kol zo inyan Aleph masha Chachma meir melamed lebchinas bina. That the Aleph is how Aleph comes down and explains things to Bina. Omnam inyan Pella shu ha'hepech Asius Aleph, it's the Asius Aleph backwards. Hainu k'shachachma el l'mayla malemes le'era keser. Is how Chachma goes up to Keser, and malemes, in other words, it gets concealed, but it's receiving from that higher level of Keser. What's Keser? The B'chins Keser, B'chins Helam, Hainu shu B'keser, B'chins Helam l'gamish, and l'gam B'chins Mokel Ishtalshus. So now he's referring back to this, because this is the 2 levels, essentially, similar to the 2 levels of Chachma Stima. That one hand, Chachma, remember Hafla and Yerida. Chachma comes down and brings things down to Bina and further. And then there's how Chachma goes up, the Koyach Ma, and connects to the things that are higher than Chachma and Keser. And that's when Chachma is called Pella. Remember we're talking about Hafla. So when Chachma is called coming down, it's called Aleph. When it goes up, it's called Pella. And that's the pasuk Kasisa Pella. So now, and then in the Kedek Kuf Tzadik Beis, he started a whole discussion. And we're talking about literally 50 pages ago. And that's when he starts on Kedek Kuf Tzadik Gimel, on page Shin Tzadik Gimel, Yibira Inyan, the Keser, the B'chinas Memutza. And he goes to the whole concept of a mamutza. And then he goes back, that was the mamutza of Kesses, Chachmas Tima, Chachma, the two levels of Chachmas Tima. And that's the flow. I don't think we have to elaborate more. I mean, obviously going back there will definitely help understand all this. And in Perek Kuf Tzadik Vav, he asked that big question, how could you say Kesser is a Mutza? And he comes to the conclusion that it has to be Chachmas Tima and Chachma, the two levels of Chachmas Tima. So that's the flow here. Why am I saying it? Because you can't understand Perek Rish Chav Daled. I don't know how much time we have, but let's at least make this connection here. So let's go. Indian who Perek Rish Chav Daled. Dini Mashakosef b'Zayar, which Zayar? We're going back now 50 pages ago. Just as it says in Seir b'Inyan Kiasisa Pella, Kisuya ulavusha the Nehera Datika. That Kasisa Pella, when you say Kasisa Pella, you made something wondrous, is referring to the level of Chochmah, how it goes up to Keser. That's a kisui. It's a cover, a levusha, and a garment, the Nehera Datika, for the light of Atik. So we learned earlier in that Perek 192, as I said 50 pages ago approximately, the B'chinas Atik liya she'ena B'chinas Achiza B'chlal, B'kli rather, and at that level of Atik, since it doesn't have any Tvis Achiza, any grasp. Okay, that's more than grasp. It's an Achiza. It doesn't have any manifestation. And a Keli, since it's like an air without a Keli, therefore it does not so concealed. Is that what he said?
Okay. So concealed.
1 second. On its own. See, a Keli conceals the light. When something is just a pure light without a Keli, in a sense, it's like on its own. We're not talking about compared to us. We don't see it.
You got to get there.
Yeah. In other words, on the level of there, it's right. It gets concealed through Chochmah. Because that's something that essentially, as soon as you start understanding something, so as soon as it manifests in a level of Chochmah, it's already the whole thing is in a Keli, the Keli of your wisdom. In other words, let me just say this. So the unconscious on its own, maybe this is connected with the Kabbalah cell. The unconscious on its own is just a level of a very high level of Gili. It doesn't have any Kalim, so there's no real Helam either. It's just what it is. And in order for a thing that is look, for Elakus to be Begili by us, we need that Tzimtzum. For Elakus to be Begili there, it doesn't need a Tzimtzum. There on that level, it's complete Gili. So bottom line, Chochmah conceals it, and by concealing it, reveals. We talked about this, was discussed a lot earlier. It has to conceal the intensity of the Elokus, of the light, for it to be able to be conceived by us. Remember, we spoke about the unconscious. If it just flew into us and there was there's no channels, it would just completely blow us away, it would destroy us. So you need to have concealment to reveal, basically. He spoke about that back then. Remember the whole idea of concealing to reveal. It's a lavush. There's a lavush that conceals to conceal. But there's a lavush, like for example, when a teacher gives a mashal, he's concealing it in a mashal, but the concealment is to reveal. It's not the same thing when a person wants to hide a secret and doesn't want to reveal it and just dresses it up or hides it somewhere. It's not the same type of concealment. Oh, there we go. So the kishu chachma is not like a garment that conceals just like that. The chachma is a concealment that the tainug, which of atik, the pleasure, becomes the level of chachma. All this was explained there, by the way, so this is not new material. The primis be'atzim chachma, the hainu b'chinas primis chachma stima, hu b'chinas hatainug atzmi, shenasa b'chinas chachma, k'moshen zbar le'il perek reish gimel. In other words, if you remember, he's talking about different types of pleasure. So we talked then that chachma be'etzim is pleasure. That was also discussed then. It was also a big chiddush. We consider wisdom as wisdom and pleasure pleasure. Earlier he spoke that pleasure is chachma. That's what he said there. This is, I have to look which perik it is. But that's why when we say Pnimis Abba is Pnimis Atik, that's what it means.
Well, also it's related to the Sichot that says that Sipur HaMedaber, the whole, maybe.
Okay. So Tainug, the Tainug of Elokus, it manifests in Chochmah. So the Pnimis of Atzmis HaChochmah, which is Pnimis Chochmah Timo, Pnimis HaTainug HaAtzmi, Shenas B'Chinas Chochmah. Oh, right here, Perik Reish Gimel. Let me just look quickly. Oh, boy. Rabbi Rashab taking us for a big ride here. It's unconscious and back, so it gets a tutzach. Okay, here we go. Omram kecha chokma hada ein atzmas hanefesh lakecha shegam shesh mok kecha shegam shesh sherish ein atzmas hanefesh. Yeah, okay. I'm looking at the kitzur. Matzim kunik l'Hashem. V'zeh shataynu v'si b'sachom v'emes hataynu v'atzmi. Emes hataynu kun atzmi nasa chokma. L'chein hachokma k'fi taynu dafka k'mechiv ha'seichel ba'binyan. Yeah. That was the example that now I remember. He spoke the example when a person, for example, wants to build a home for himself. Is the pleasure that drives the chachma. So you have pleasure in the idea of having a home, and therefore you conceive of ideas of how to build that home according to your pleasure. But he says deeper. That doesn't mean that pleasure drives the chachma. The pleasure is the chachma. The chachma, the pnimius, is just a tool of tainug. Mm-hmm. So we can really understand it by the Eibishter much more than by us, because we're too fragmented. You say in the Sava Kodesh Baruch Hu Liyas Le'Dira B'Tachteinim, he had a taiva. Atzmos had a taiva to have a dira b'tachteinim. But Mela, he created Chochmah and Bina and Das and Chesed and Gvura to fulfill the Nesava. So Chochmah is just a form of the Nesava as it manifests in the tools you need.
Is Taiva the same as the Tainug?
I'm just using it as an example. Taiva and Tainug is usually connected. Taiva is the level of Tainug, the desire.
Until finally the end of time, the dira b'tachteinim isn't completely made, so it doesn't have. It has its taiva for.
It's always rooted in the taiva. It's always rooted in the taiva, meaning l'mayla mesech. Taiva, you don't ask a question. Atzmos desired it. That desire
is have a tainig in the future, though. But there's no future in tainig.
No. The taiva is also the aveda in building it. Yeah. The nesava is when we build it right now. We're fulfilling the nesava. The fulfillment will be when it comes out begili, but nesava from day one. That's so essentially from the Mila, when you talk from the Elikus perspective, Tainug, everything is really B'Pnimius Tainug. Chochmah, which is the beginning of all the spheres, is really Tainug manifesting through a tool called Chochmah. So this is the reason the Chochmah has pleasure. It's not, we think of it that you have a lot of types of, you eat, you have pleasure. When you drink, you have pleasure. You have a party, and then also when you think, when you have wisdom. The truth is now, he says, Pnimius Abba, Pnimius Atik, that the etzem Chochmah, the Pnimius of Chochmah is really Tainug. That's essentially what he said there.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty mind-blowing stuff. Yeah.
In Pnimius of mind, when he brings the levels of pleasure, so Chochmah is the highest level of pleasure, physical pleasure.
Fine, that's consistent with this. Yeah.
Because the Pnimius of Chochmah is Tainug, which means it's Atik. So this is
okay. So this is the meaning of bezehu misalim, nasa b'chinas chachma, and this is the meaning kasisa pella kisur v'levusha denehera da'atika, kasisa pella, that chachma, that atik is misalim, is concealed and revealed by becoming chachma. Umamela moving the b'chinas hakisei ein zeh rak shemachasa mailam al eze koyach shalamaylam ameno. So Mamela, we understand from this that this concealment is not like when we just say something hides and conceals and covers something that's higher than it, a higher level. For example, like every lower faculty, that is a garment and the manifestation of a higher faculty. So like, for example, lower faculties conceal, or a lower koyach conceals and the higher faculties, like an ilav ol. Ilav ol is referring to, for example, meichin amidus, or something like that, or anything that's a cause and effect that the lower conceals the higher. Shehein keiches muvdalim zemezeh, because there you're talking about different faculties that are separate from one another. So therefore, when one, for example, let's just, I'm just using my own example. I don't know if this is his example. For example, let's say you take your idea and you write it down on paper. So your hand is becoming a keli for your mind. But when you write, it's always going to conceal how much you're thinking. You can't reveal as much as in your mind. It has to conceal it somewhat. Why? Because writing is a limited version and it's not intense like the mind. So there, it's expressing it, but it has to conceal by nature because it's a different koyach. In contrast to that, the helam hazeh ain't a helam atzmi, because this concealment is not the concealment that helam atzmi, that the essential helam that is really an ultimate gili. Because the higher koyach comes down on a shinei mehus, it changes its personality, it changes its mehus, its essence. It changes its features, its properties. V'nasu koyach hatachton. So it's in other words, it's not that way. It's not that the koyach elyon is just manifesting, but it's really it's like a garment that conceals. Therefore, you don't really have, like I said in the hand, you don't have the mind is not suddenly the mind is in your fingers. You don't have the atzmus koyach elyon. You don't have the essential higher faculty. Only a reflection of it. And the koyach hatachton, the lower faculty that conceals, is not a complete concealment. Because even after the concealment, you still have a reflection. Like I said, when you write, you are writing wisdom. So there's some reflection of the ideas, except it comes down in a concealed fashion. By contrast, the helam of Chochmah that he's talking the Kisui Levush is a whole different thing. That's a whole different type of level. There, it's just a level of concealment. And here, Chochmah is Tainug. It is the same Mahus. So Tainug itself, pleasure itself, is actually manifesting in the Chochmah. And in that it gets concealed. This type of cover and concealment is an atzmi. So it's not like an outside force, like a garment or a muscle, an example that you dress up an idea in order to bring it down. Here, the concealment is part of the whole process, is atzmi. Atzmus hatayim mamish v'nasmechin chochmah, because this is the atzmus hatayim that just manifests itself in chochmah. Ubezem misalim b'chinas hatayim atzmi, uhu b'chinas helam gomer. And on the other hand, it's not like the helam of the other one, which is only a limited helam. This is a complete helam. V'zau inyan b'chinas hastimus the primis chochmas t'mah shesosim v'nelam b'etzim. And this is the concealment of primis chochmas t'mah that is completely concealed. I know it's confusing a bit, but basically it comes down to this. Completely concealed is really completely revealed, in a way. It's concealed from us, but it's atzmius is the full intensity of it. In other words, is the unconscious a concealed level or a revealed level? The truth is, it's concealed to us, but if you're there, it's the ultimate revelation. So that's really what he's saying here. Whereas, for example, in Seder Shtalshlus, a light goes, diminishes. Here, there's no diminishing going on. It's just the question: is it? It's a completely different dimension, basically. So it's concealed from us. Technically, we don't see it, but it's not concealed as in like an example conceals. So when that atzmizdik helam comes into, this needs more explanation. I think we should stop here, right?
Yeah.
Basically. I think we should stop right here because he's going to elaborate more afterwards. Okay. So we conclude the middle of Perek Reish Chav Daled, and we'll resume.
Here tomorrow, same time, same station.
It's fine with me. Tomorrow.
Okay.